Good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Landay. I'm the Vice Director here at Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, and we welcome you to join us this afternoon for a great conversation that we have set up with Fei-Fei Li and Eric Horvitz. For those who don't know HAI, we're an interdisciplinary policy institute here at Stanford, where we are focused on how to shape AI for the good of humanity by looking at research, education, and policy, as well as collaborating with folks in government, non-government organizations, as well as industry to further those goals. This afternoon, we have this great conversation for you with really two of the leading voices in AI and thinking about AI in human values. And really, this came to us in an idea because both Fei-Fei and Eric had the great honor this last year of giving a Tanner lecture, which is the Tanner lecture series has been going for many years and is focused on human values. And they were invited to give these at different places. I think Eric did yours at Michigan and Fei-Fei at Yale. We also hosted one here at Stanford at HAI. And we felt, hey, what a great idea. We could have Eric and Fei-Fei talk a bit about some of the ideas that were in their lectures and have a little back and forth between them. So first, let me introduce our speakers. And first, we'll start with Eric. So if you don't know Eric, he's the Chief Scientific Officer of Microsoft, where he's really led advances in machine learning, natural language understanding, decision theory, probability, and human AI interaction, among many others. He's also been an important voice for calling out the technical and societal challenges with AI. He's worked on things like AI safety and alignment, looking at what are risks to civil liberties and ethics in AI with respect to things like military and national security. And he serves on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which is, one of the most prestigious positions in terms of giving advice to the president on science and technology. He's also been a leader in responsible AI efforts at Microsoft, but also co-founding the Partnership in AI in 2016, a nonprofit that brings together leading tech companies, civil society, and academics to discuss these types of issues. Eric's done a lot of service besides there within the AI research community. So he was president of the AAAI. He's also a member of the National Academy of Engineering, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American College of Medical Informatics, and the American Philosophical Society, which I didn't know. But he's no stranger to Stanford. So besides being on a distinguished fellow here at HAI and on our advisory committee, Eric earned both his PhD and MD here at Stanford, so he's been a friend to Stanford for a long time. And Eric and his wife also helped establish the 100-year study on AI, which is a longitudinal study of AI's impact that is housed here at HAI. So we're really thrilled to have him today. So let's give a big welcome to Eric. And Eric, come on up here. And I'm also happy to introduce my colleague and friend, Fei-Fei Li, who is the founder and co-director of Stanford HAI and is a leading computer scientist and a leading expert in AI. Her expertise includes cognitively inspired AI, machine learning, deep learning, computer vision, and ambient intelligence systems for healthcare. Fei-Fei is very well known for many different things, but one is being the inventor of ImageNet and the ImageNet Challenge, which really played a key role in advancing computer vision methods, and more importantly, in my opinion, helped kick off the deep learning revolution, which is what everyone is talking about today. She was also someone focused on the future of AI in the field by co-founding AI for All, which is a national program aimed at increasing inclusion and diversity in AI education. She's also a leader seen throughout the field by her membership as a member of the National Academy of Engineering, but also the National Academy of Medicine, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's also done work to help the public sector understand issues with AI. So she served on the California Future of Work Commission and the National AI Research Resource Task Force at the federal level, which has been helping with developing legislation to improve the computing infrastructure needed for academia to be able to make contributions in AI. In the private sector, Fei-Fei has served as a VP at Google, where she was the chief scientist for AI at Google Cloud. And she's also, before these things, was the director of Stanford's famous AI lab, or SAIL. So please welcome Fei-Fei. Okay, so as I said, we're mainly going to have a conversation between Fei-Fei and Eric. And, we could have each of these folks talk for hours on many different topics on AI and interaction. But we wanted to kind of use the theme of their Tanner lectures as something to guide our conversation a little bit. So I'm going to start off with a couple of questions, maybe just to get us going. So Eric, in your Tanner lecture, you started by taking the audience back into the distant past of humanity, and also your trips around the world in pursuit of foundations for human intelligence. Can you tell us more about those trips, and why did you frame your lecture on AI with this walk back in time?
Well, thanks, James. So I came to Microsoft, it's a Freudian slip. I came to Stanford, actually, major org in my life, interested in human mind, and with set up to do an MD PhD in neuroscience. So my motivations for going into AI have been all about what I might call the computational foundations of mind, which I think apply to what we're trying to do in AI as well as to our human minds. So that's always been on my mind. It's in the forefront of my mind in everything that I've done in artificial intelligence research. Can I build up insights into what might be at the foundations of our own intellect? And in my Tanner lecture, it was an opportunity to talk to the audience about what I've been trying to do over the years, even when I'm taking family trips. So I mentioned an early trip that I went on in pursuit of the first recorded tool making by an ancestor of Homo sapiens, Homo habilis, to the Ogilvy Gorge in Africa, and speaking to experts about what was known about the rise of this tool making, what was distinctive at that time. And what I learned on that trip brought me back on another family trip, this time to the caves of Spain and France. Homo habilis was 2 million years ago. The trip to the caves of Spain and France, we're looking at humans around 400,000 years ago to about 30,000 years ago. And the most amazing thing that really framed the whole Tanner lecture is a finding that the architecture of Homo sapiens, our mind and body plan, have not changed in any significant way for 400,000 years. But something very mysterious happened around 40 to 45,000 years ago that changed everything about who it is that we are and led to civilization. And it's called a number of things, but one phrase is the symbolic explosion. And so that trip back to those caves, to this transition point between humans, Homo sapiens, being more or less like every other animal on the planet, to Homo sapiens that are so different, so distinct, buildings, structures, civilization as we know it, technology, deep understandings, to the point where for centuries we didn't even identify with animals. We were something very different. Well, we are very different. What was the mystery? And the answer, I think, is that we are different in that, and we continue to be different in that we have evolved ourselves through the tools of our own imagination and creation, starting with our language. Language is a human invention, the rich language. And there's evidence that the richness of our language reached a threshold, expressiveness and power of reflection that led to collaboration, specialization, an accumulative society that could build on itself over time, that we co-evolved with. And to make a long story short, because it's already pretty long of an answer, this is a selling point, maybe the lecture, I get to the point where I say, I believe that artificial intelligence, the rise of that tool, is another really fundamental time for humanity, and that over the next several hundred years, we will be co-evolving potentially as powerfully as we did with our language as a prior invention, and make the case for that and talk about how it might go well and how we can guide it.
So I think we're going to come back to language in this conversation in a minute, but I want to ask Fei-Fei a similar question, because I think in her Tanner lecture, she also goes back in time and maybe even further back, a lot further back, and really talks about the evolution of life in general and vision and the importance of vision to us as a species. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the introduction of your Tanner lecture, Fei-Fei?
Sure. First of all, Eric, your Tanner lecture is wonderful. And for those of you who hasn't watched it, it's on YouTube, and highly recommend watching Eric's Tanner lecture. So yes, it's funny that you said you started your study here at Stanford with the general concept of intelligence, both for lives as well as for machines. And I had a similar journey. I started as a physics major and learned as a physics major, the only thing you're good at doing is, or at least you're taught to do, is to ask audacious questions about space-time. And the most audacious question about space-time I can think of in the universe is, what does it mean to be intelligent? And that's how I got into AI in my own journey. And what happened in my Tanner lecture is I took time back beyond 400,000 years, or a little longer, to 540 million years. So what happened there?
It's a competition.
Yeah, exactly. It's also a mystery, because zoologists found in about a very short period of time, 10 million years in fossil study, the number of animal species from fossils exploded between 540 million years to 530 million years. And they call it the Cambrian Explosion, or the Big Bang of evolution. And there is a lot of mystery around why that happened, and theories around climate change, around our ocean, because all animals' lives began in the ocean and were living in the ocean. The chemical composition was changing. But one really interesting finding in fossil study by an Australian zoologist called Andrew Parker is that around 540 million years, fossils told us that the first animals likely to be a trilobite started to have photosensitive receptors. In other words, it was the first time animals can see. And it's also around the time, probably possibly even a little older, they start to develop the sense of touch. But fundamentally, it's the onset of perception. What does it mean to have the perception? You have to imagine yourself as a trilobite, living in the primordial soup, floating around. All you do is waiting for dinner to come by your mouth. Or you float yourself to become someone else's dinner. And the first trilobite, whoever that is, figuratively speaking, of course, who saw the lights, means the world is a buffet. Because nobody else saw it, you can grab food wherever you want. And Andrew Parker called it that the onset of vision set off an evolutionary arms race that animals are forced to evolve. Otherwise, you'll either die or just go extinct. And what does that force of evolution mean? It means many things, but one of the most important things is the evolution of the nervous system. it's the evolution of intelligence. As we perceive the world, as we sense our environment, as we navigate across our environment, as we learn to use our body to interact with the environment, we have to start doing the more and more complex computing. Otherwise, you can't handle it. Otherwise, you can't figure out what is the shape or the color or the predators or the food in front of you. And that's the evolutionary force that carried the evolution of animals towards till 400,000 years ago, we start to see the first humans walking on Earth. And that's what fascinates me. To me, perception, especially driven by visual perception, but it's really multisensory perception, is a huge piece of the puzzle of intelligence. Today, everybody, I'm sure, will talk about ChatGPT and beyond. Everybody look at machine intelligence as a disembodied agent living in the form of piece of software, living on the cloud, living in the shape of APIs. And it is pretty remarkable. But evolution began with embodied intelligence, where we use our perception to understand, to infer, to reconstruct, to recognize what the world is around us, and to in turn interact with it, and to in turn make ourselves more intelligent. And that journey for machines has only just begun. And that's where my research is vision and robotic learning. And I think that is as mighty as ChatGPT. I'm pointing to him because their company made it. As mighty as the language models are, I think the next piece of the intelligence puzzle is the perception and the fully interactive intelligence in an embodied form.
Okay, so one thing we like to joke about as faculty is sometimes we never even have a chance to really talk, except like when we're traveling and we're at a conference in the same city. So I like to listen to my colleagues on the podcast. Our colleague Russ Altman, who's also a great friend of Eric's, has this podcast, The Future of Everything. If you haven't checked it out, you should get it. He essentially interviews Stanford faculty, and Russ, I wish Russ could be here today up here because he's way better at this than me. But anyways, I was listening to it on my commute yesterday on my bike, and Russ was interviewing our colleague Chris Manning, who's a computer scientist and computational linguist, and he was saying, yeah, people have been building language models since the 70s. We use them usefully for speech recognition in the 90s, neural models even late 90s, but there was this big explosion that we've seen over the last few years. And these models have done things that even the experts who are building these kind of things didn't expect at all. Now, so maybe we're seeing kind of this transition like, Eric saw in the caves or inferred from the caves as language became really important, clearly transmits knowledge and allows us to kind of evolve in that way. What was the surprise for you, Eric? I mean, maybe you weren't too surprised since you helped Microsoft invest in this, but, I think for many of us, this has gone much faster than people were thinking. So I'm wondering if you could give us a little sense of, since language is so important, what happened there? Why is it surprising? Why is it even showing results that maybe are beyond what experts like any of the folks in this room might have expected this quickly?
Well, first of all, since 2009, I think we've all been impressed with the deep neural network models and what they can do. I mean, they've kind of blown past long-standing records in perception and language for quite a while now. But in going for me, I'll say that our team at Microsoft gained access to what's now called GPT-4 when it was codenamed DaVinci 3 in August or late August, September of last year, because my area, we do the safety work. And so the first people that got the access to the OpenAI model that had just been finished back then it was called, I think, even GPT-4 base, we refer to it as now. It wasn't shaped yet. We looked at this model, and to me, it was, two words came to mind in trying to play with it. And this is comparing it to just GPT 3.5. First word was, there's been a phase transition that we don't understand, that came with something that was done differently. Of course, the scale, but something is different here. And another word that came to mind in trying many things on the safety team to characterize the model was polymathic. Like, this system combined methods and disciplines with fluidity and in an instantaneous way in ways that we weren't used to as humans. You would need a full room full of people trained in different areas to spend time to weave together the kind of answers we were seeing, whether it be in a medicine or the natural sciences or in political science, or even combinations of those things. Well, no problem, I'll combine those things for you. And it raised many questions. Now, some of you probably seen this paper that I entitled, I came up with the title for this, Sparks of AGI. Maybe it was a bad idea to use that title, but that's exactly how I felt. As we probed and tried different things, we formed a team, and we just sat together and looking at what I would call surprising emergence of the form we could not and still cannot explain deeply. The notion that we had a phase transition without a deep scientific change in methodology beyond scale, and the notion that we would be, especially because of what we saw, potentially pushing for more scale, meant there would probably be future phase transitions. And while we could predict some of the capabilities on these, what are called laws of scaling for deep neural models that we've learned over time to make predictions on some things that we already understand, it's pretty clear we don't understand how to predict the emergence. And we get at it. It raises curiosity. It frames new areas of research, and it raises, I think, among many people, concerns.
Can I add some? I totally agree with what Eric is saying. I do want to make two comments. I think one is to double click on what Eric said. Everything we've seen, especially what people tend to ask us if we're surprised by GPT and all that. In one sense, yes, the incredible phase transition results. But I really want to remind all of us is that there is a really important, powerful concept that started, is really the concept of data. As the internet age brought us the incredible amount of data to humanity, to human civilization, we're seeing the acceleration of technology on this front in a very different way than before. We've actually had glimpses of this. It just didn't get to the point of ChatGPT. The first glimpse was the ImageNet Challenge. A few years after the first time we rolled out ImageNet Challenge, by 2016, machines were performing better than humans in terms of classifying pictures of 1,000 objects. Now you talk about machines being able to know from chemistry to medicine to accounting. It's hard for humans to even recognize 1,000 weird objects, and machines could easily do that. Then we quickly see AlphaGo. It was machines learning from 4,000 years of playing Go that start to extrapolate the data it sees. So it really is a continuation of that story of large-scale data supported by large-scale compute. But it was really that story that's really carrying us. And I see, if you think about evolution, I want to go back to the trilobite living in the primordial soup, the ocean. The onslaught of data to our animal intelligence both in one's lifetime as well as in the evolution sense, is phenomenal. And we're going to see that driving machine intelligence further.
And I'll just make a comment here, which might get back to trilobites and clams and so on the way up to Homo sapiens. I think I say clam because I always think of the somatogastric ganglion. If you're a neurobiologist, it's a classic apparatus that's studied quite a bit in invertebrate neurobiology. And this is the idea that, and this is the intuition that, maybe the insight, going from intuition, maybe it's actually an insight now. So we're building these models now, right? Their objective function, the base one is predict the next word, predict the next word, predict the next word, a simple prediction task. And we say, we're going to give you lots of data and about the world, someday visual data and so on, and lots of compute. And we put pedal to the metal, and we say, predict the next word, do it even better now. And pushing on this simple objective function balloons out, literally balloons out a rich representation that we believe is a rich representation of the world and of reasoning about the world itself. In the same way, I'll make an analogy now, is I conjecture that relatively simple prediction tasks of that trilobite, where it might go, what it might do next, whether that somatogastric ganglion in the clam should close or open that siphon, given a wave crashing sound or a vibration, push really hard on that objective function in a competitive environment. Because if you don't do better than the next clam closing and opening the siphon, or the next trilobite looking for its breakfast, or avoiding being eaten by the bigger thing, whatever it might be in the sea, whether it could see or not, it can wipe out or completely put pressure on that simple objective function, ballooning out representations and abilities in internal worlds. So this is the insight that's come to me as a kind of a really a neurobiologist in AI clothes now, as to what's been going on. We're learning about how intelligences are formed, likely with simple objective functions that are under competitive pressure.
But of course, your trilobite or clam uses probably 0.001 watt. The entire human brain also uses 35 watts. Yeah. So there is still
a gap.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Yeah. We're not saying, when I said intuition may be an insight, I hope I wasn't saying conclusion or result. I mean, I think that there are such deep mysteries of biological intelligence that we don't understand. And some people take that as inspiration for keep moving forward in AI and learning a lot more than we know now. Certainly, we're going to know a lot. We will know a lot more 25 years from now at this speed of work, and it's not just scale, it's going to be insights, controls, understanding. And I believe that will have quite a bit of reflection back on our questions about ourselves and about neurobiology as well. And I also imagine that someday we'll look back and we'll say, you needed like a nuclear power plant to build that model. We know how to do that now. That was kind of like, you guys didn't know how to do that very well.
Well, maybe we'll come back to this. So I hope one thing the PhD students out there should not be fearful that, there's no research to do. There's lots of interesting questions that this is raising. But I want to get back to this. What's interesting is we kind of skipped the language, these large language models, and you're saying they're going to get bigger and bigger, and eventually only some large corporations can be able to do it, or maybe the U.S. government, and we can talk about that. But maybe they're going to asymptote. We already see things that they're not good at. Maybe Fei-Fei can speak about this. Do we think we're going to need that embodied intelligence that has some other understanding of our physical world beyond what's represented on words on the internet, to be able to get other pieces of intelligence that these large language models, or foundation models, I should say, do not show?
I absolutely think we have a very exciting path forward in embodied intelligence. I don't think embodied intelligence is the only path forward of intelligence. If you look at today's language models, whether we argue it's AGI or not, it is absolutely a form of intelligence, and it's disembodied, and there's no question about it. But I think I do personally believe that in addition to the symbolic representation and knowledge organization, as well as generation of languages and sequence models, the interactive embodied perception and understanding and decision making of the world is deeply profound. And it's not just, I don't see it as just a simple extension of a sequential model, because language is fundamentally sequential and fundamentally generative for humans, but perception is not. Perception is actually a lot more discriminative. It also, you have to do a lot of reconstruction and comparison of the real world. How you grab this microphone, like how I approach my hand, is not just a generative process. It's also a recognition, what we call it, or discriminative process. So I think there is, putting the embodiment into the development of intelligence, we're going to see profound, interesting technologies coming out of it. And I think also, fundamentally, I'm sure Eric has a lot to say about this, we want our technology to help the world. And if we want that to happen, the world is physical. And we need physically embodied agents along with humans to make the world better. I know a lot of you are running this word machine overlord in your mind once you hear me saying this. And I'm not denying one day we might face challenges, whether in software agents as well as embodied agents. But I do want to make sure we imagine the many, many positive use cases of embodied intelligence. For example, every one of you, well, most of you, are old enough, saw the news of Fukushima nuclear plant disaster, and the humans going in there, knowing they're going to die of exposure of radiation to deal with that. Those are the moments me as a computer scientist, AI scientist, watch the news and realize that's what our technology can do, disaster relief to help humans. Or in healthcare, I'm not going to belabor that too much. Eric does a lot of work in healthcare as well. Every day I work with our clinicians, and I want all of you to know in America, and I'm pretty sure worldwide, we don't have excessive labor. We have, as of 2023, a shortage of more than 1 million nurses. We have a growing aging population. We have increasing mental health issues. We have, a lot of human problems in this society where agents, robots, can alongside help humans taking care of each other. So whether it's for application or just the profound scientific reason, I believe embodied intelligence is one of the next most exciting areas of AI.
Maybe we should just make a comment, though. It's not like we shouldn't be all focused on just the large language models as the only frontier. For over 15, 20 years, there's been fabulous research going on in the realm of embodied intelligence. So we have one at Microsoft Research called Situated Interaction, all about the coordination of people and machines in a shared physical space where there's a shared physical reality that the machine and multiple humans understand, and there's common ground. And we reason about coordination in these spaces. And so a lot of that work in robotics, in HRI, human-robot interaction in that space, hasn't necessarily meshed yet with the advances in the language, in the large-scale language models. But we have lots of insights and intuitions from really cool, fun research on the embodied interaction work.
Yep.
So, one of the things that has really been great for me knowing Eric, most of his career, he's really been one of these people who's been able to cross from medicine to AI to human-computer interaction. And you have one of these very classic papers in the field on mixed initiative interfaces. And I actually think a lot of the press on ChatGPT and this stuff seems very simplistic in thinking how these things will fit into how we interact with computers. Do you have kind of some comments you might have thinking about all that work you've done for 20 years on how we might think of them more in we've talked about intelligence augmentation and that vein of thinking about how we'll interact with this?
Yeah, I think whenever I hear ChatGPT, I always say, well, you mean the ChatGPT interaction model or the interface, because beneath it is a fabric of intellect or machine intellect that can be shaped and harnessed in so many different ways with different kinds of interaction models and so on. We were just talking at dinner a couple nights ago about one of the big driving forces per vision that we've had for decades, whether people know it or not, is J.C.R. Licklider, who wrote this incredible paper that's, for me, has always been such an inspiration, published in 1960, called, and apologies to the women in the audience, Man-Machine Symbiosis. He meant human-machine symbiosis. But it's a beautiful paper where he calls out, after seeing the first interactive model that ever was built, I think, called Whirlwind, but he calls out, he said, wow, someday machines will work with people in this really fluid manner, understanding the problem that the human is looking at, understanding where they are, understanding what cognitive gaps they might need to jump that they can handle, understand where they should step back and let the human take over because they don't understand something, and how to communicate even with sparkles or pops or audio signals in a really fluid way that they're working together as a team. Now, Licklider, who ended up funding as a DARPA program manager, he was actually a psychologist. I'm looking at Johannes out there, a psychologist interested in computing and how computing could augment human cognition as well as civilization through the proper kinds of interfaces and interaction models. Thought deeply about funding programs like the one that led to the famous demo of all time, Doug Engelbart's demo. He funded
mother of all
demos. I forgot the actual phrase used, but the mouse graphical interface. But I always said that was just like a tiny piece of the Licklider vision. He was really interested in cognition, taking it further. And so now that we have these more powerful fabrics, whether they be language-based, and they'll soon be multimodal, how can we sort of think deeply about how to harness them in various kinds of tasks, whether it be healthcare or daily life, running a home, education, to augment what people do in a way that's very positive and that helps us with our goals.
Yeah. I want to just follow up on that. The very space all of you are sitting in is Stanford's HumanCentered AI Institute. And when we founded this institute together with James and many of the faculty leaders, we believed in fundamentally AI is for human augmentation. So human-computer interaction is a very core part of that, but there is more than just the physical interaction. Is how AI agents can serve in so many ways to augment human productivity, human imagination, human can collaborate and to make human well-being better. For example, James, you work on education. Using AI, machine learning algorithms to make tutorial teaching more effective and personalized. We have also faculty working in many areas of medicine, healthcare, from physical rehabilitation to medical records, auto documentation. We have scientific discovery now can be massively augmented by AI. Think about the famous AlphaFold project. That's just the beginning. So So I think it's really important, especially in these few weeks, I guess, or months, that the overwhelming news or public discourse is this fear of this technology or this taking away our human agency, where I actually think here at HAI, we believe the true agency is still about human and human society, human community, but how AI can help.
And one of the themes at Microsoft these days in our design ethic is to think deeply about human as pilot for the design, machine as co-pilot. How can we make designs such that the human is in the driver's seat at all times and machines are helping them with their goals? You can easily, without thinking deeply, design things the other way around. And I think that the real payoff for human empowerment will be with human as pilot. And that takes quite a bit of interesting creativity and design work.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had HAI had a conference here in the fall where we purposely said, we don't believe in this idea of humans in the loop. Like that was too much, the machine having too much agency. And we said humans in charge as a way of really putting you in the pilot seat. We're going to open up to audience questions in a few minutes. We'll be using this mic. But before we get there, I want to get a little bit back at the Tanner lectures being about human values. So I want to touch on the values in some different ways. So one question I would have is, we're seeing, at least in this current big, takeoff of AI, which, AI is taken off in different times in different ways. But in this current last 6 months, or, really the last 3 years in many ways, that there's a lot of power concentrated in large companies who have the money to build these large models. What do we think in terms of, what are the human values questions, values about democracy, values about choice, values about surveillance, things like this that may be at risk here, and how might we think about it as a community to, surface those questions and do something about it? Fei-Fei, do you have a comment?
Well, you talk about large companies.
Well, I'm going to have you. I'm going to ask you both to comment on it.
Well, first of all, I think all the human value issues, from privacy to ethics to bias and all this, I don't think it's inherently related to large company, and all of us individually even have that responsibility. I believe, and I'm going to paraphrase our one of our faculty director leaders at HAI, Professor Rob Reich, is that we have to bake ethics into the design of the technology, not treat it as an aftermath. So, for example, I'll just give a very concrete example. My own work using smart cameras is in the healthcare delivery environment. For example, in the ICUs, it turned out there are many, many opportunities that's unintendedly going to harm patients, whether it's patients under medication fall out of bed, or there are very intricate procedures that clinicians needs to conduct, and if the process is not well conducted, you miss something, you forget the pressure stockings to prevent blood clotting, or your hand hygiene practice is not well done, that introduces infection. So all this is causing harms to patients. So we put cameras into this environment and work with clinicians to try to use AI's tireless smartness to help capture these moments. Well, immediately the question of privacy arises, right? It's you're watching humans, you're watching workers, healthcare workers working. So you introduce the issue of falseware. You're watching patients in their vulnerable, most vulnerable moments. And so it was really fascinating when we begin this journey. We begin working with the clinicians. Before our students start to write a line of code, we were introduced to much more human issues that we had thought about computer vision issues. And we immediately realized that in a way it's by forcing, but it was such a healthy lesson to learn that before we think about what codes to write, we need to talk to the stakeholders. We need to talk to the nurses, the patients, the clinicians to understand all the human issues. And that wasn't even enough. Very quickly, computer scientists like me and my students realized we don't even know how to handle some of these issues. And doctors might not even know because they're trained medically to cure people, but not necessarily as ethicists. So we had to invite actual bioethicists and legal scholars and philosophers to join our team. So quickly we become this multi-stakeholder, multi-expertise, multidisciplinary team to help us tackle these problems. So one example is that my computer vision student who probably came to my lab thinking we're doing algorithms to recognize human behaviors quickly had to go to security computer security experts to learn about differential privacy algorithms, to learn about encryption. And then we start to think about typical machine learning algorithms might not work in this setting. Let's really look into federated learning. Let's really look into edge computing. So I'm using this story to show that ethical values, whether it's privacy or bias, goes hand in hand with the development of technology. I do worry now the way most of the conversation or even practice is conducted is that we've got those who code and build softwares, and then we have watchdogs who just call out their mistakes or yell at them or really advocate for people at the receiving end, which is important. But we need to bring people onto the table from the start, bring the receivers, the consumers, the users of this technology, the advocates, the ethical legal scholars, and the technologists onto the table together as early as possible. And that's how we have been trying to do research here. And I know your group has some efforts in that as well.
Yeah, so I'll take a slightly different cut on the answer to James's question. I believe it's looking back at this time that we're in right now, from 500 years from now, the next 50 years will be recognizable. And to have it go well, because it can go in different directions, to have it go well is going to take lots of collaboration and guidance and thinking deeply about values as well as values and technology and vice versa. And then taking it more personally, I've always felt like scientists working in a field, no matter how geeky and technical they are, need to be really cognizant and think broadly about the influence of their ideas and their innovations on people and society. And it's going to take, back to my first comment, engagement by civil society, by academia, industry, and government. Kind of like four big sectors, probably some more I'd like to throw in there, to work together on some of these rising issues, especially around values when that comes up for shaping the technologies and how they're used, the applications, the scenarios, the case studies that we do, and so on. So as AAAI president, I stood up what was called the AAAI Presidential Panel on Long-Term AI Futures in 2008. People thought I was crazy, like, wait, AI barely works. I said, yeah, but let's get going on this. And we had a meeting at Asilomar with a great group. And that meeting was so useful and valuable, I thought, in framing questions, that 5 years later, I said, we should do that again and again and again. And that was where the 100-year study came from. Every 5 years, it's kind of like taking that AAAI experience and just replicating it with the best academics, cross-disciplinary, that would be working on proactive guidance. On government agencies, the idea of imbuing reports and recommendations with notions of value-centered, even in the CIA report, American values. We even called out, democracy and civil liberties and so on. How do you imbue systems with these, even if you're working on Defense Department applications? And then for industry, it's been interesting. I've always felt like, okay, this is really my primary home. I can work on the AI partnership. I can work on 100-year study, academics, civil society groups, but I really need to take it home. In 2016, we kicked off some of our efforts to define Microsoft's point of view, and we took it all the way to our senior leadership team. What's our point of view on artificial intelligence in terms of like, can we lay down some values we might all agree upon and define them? And you can read about them on the web. We have 6 values that define almost everything that we do. It led to what's called our Responsible AI Standard, which is concrete, not just principles, but like what every product team building AI systems must do, including impact statements, risk analysis, red teaming, and so on, to make sure that our systems are aligned with these values, including safety, reliability, and transparency, accountability, fairness, and so on.
Great. So I think, it's clear from these answers that we're going to need some combination of government oversight, corporate practices, university education, technology. Not one of these things is going to solve it all. We need to hit it from multiple angles. So we have a few more minutes. We'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. We have a mic over here on this side. So if you could go over to that mic, line up, and when you're called on, please introduce yourself. And we may not be able to get to everyone depending on how long it goes. But let's start with you right there.
Hi, I'm John Markoff.
John.
Hi, Eric. Hi, Fei-Fei. I was wondering if I could ask you guys to react to 2 recent things. One is a paper that leaked from Google on May 4th called No Moats that suggested the open source community might be an effective competitor to the companies with large resources. And in that same vein, this technique I think it's called low rank adaptation to large language models that suggests that they actually may scale down more effectively than we have thought. So both of those would suggest the dynamics might be very different shortly.
And to me, John, I think the concepts in that that white paper, and there's been lots of debate about whether you can really do some of the things without the resources, but certainly with the low rank work, we're probably going to need regulation. So I have to say, I think that there will likely have to be regulation about the uses of these models in the wild and new kinds of laws. So I tend to be an optimistic person, and I'm optimistic that there'll be ways to build powerful models without all that resource.
Any comments on that?
Even before the No Moats paper, open source has been, a discussion, and also we're seeing open source models, right? Of course, Facebook's model was kind of leaked, but we're seeing more and more open source effort. Set aside a little bit of other forces at play, I think open source is a huge part of the technology development. I mean, we see this in operating systems. We see this in many other places. So from a business point of view, I agree that open source effort will be interesting, competitive effort to the closed models. Open source is also very interesting for open science, as at least within the walls of our country, open science has served us really well. And once again, here in academia, we will never have the $10 billion unless Microsoft gives us the $10 billion they gave to OpenAI. Will not be able to do that kind of development, but with open source models, we can build upon that. So that's important. But there are other forces at play. Regulation is really important. Without belaboring the answer, I actually think we need to see regulation both in terms of the application end, where the rubber meets the road, and whether we're channeling into medical regulation or financial industry regulation or other regulation. And we also need to see some regulatory effort in development as well. So I think it's very interesting. One thing about that No Moats paper, I personally find it a little extreme because a lot of moats in technology is built in a integrated way. Even if two, let's say, labs or company have the exact raw data, the way the data is curated, the way the training, the engineering, there's a lot of modes that's built in, that in an integrated way. Just by saying no modes, to me, is a little bit of an extreme statement.
I've wondered if someday, if there are many of these kinds of sources of these kinds of capabilities, and you can call them in your application, there'll be either regulations or desire to call the model that has gone through the shaping, that has the kind of the structural values that you agree with, that won't do things that harm people or groups or nation states. It's interesting that the C2PA, this is the work going on to do content provenance, to establish that content is genuine and came from a camera, for example, all the way to your display. That group of that standards body just extended their work to models to certify cryptographically that this model is the model you think it is. So when you call it, if it's trained in the way you believe and for the values that you believe and the resources that went into shaping it for the way it should perform are true to the indication.
I think the open source movement here is going to be really key. And I would note, for those of you who don't know, on the 24th of this month, we have a symposium on how is AI affecting creativity in the arts. And part of that is how are these models, sucking up a lot of artists' work, and what are the implications of that from both copyright and people's jobs perspective.
I'd be happy to hear, James, that the C2PA standard for this manifest that sits over art, videos, audiovisual content now has a flag, no training allowed with this, as part of the definition of the creator's art.
Yeah, and unfortunately, with the open source, all it takes is one bad actor to say, "I don't care what that flag says." So, okay, is there a next question here at the mic? Introduce yourself.
Hi there. I'm Eric. Hello.
Hey, nice to meet you.
This is a question for Eric. Yes, for myself. What does your collaboration model with OpenAI look like, and how does that affect you from like an organizational level? Because like your interests are largely aligned, but sometimes they differ. And how do you deal with that?
Well, I'll just say that there's a governance model that's abided by. We just had a great meeting today, right before this meeting, with a group of peers making some decisions and reflecting. It's great. It's great collaboration. I think it's been a really fabulous collaboration with shared values. In fact, my sense is when we first started talking, what came first was a discussion of values. Like, we're really on the same page when it came to safety, for example, of these systems, and the joint, shared, mutual goal of these technologies benefiting people in society. Now, that's as far as I'll go. I mean, of course, there are detailed relationship documents and discussions and legal constructs, but at the top level, it's a great collaboration. There's clear separation of what we do at times, but also a great coordination.
Step up to the mic, as they say.
Hi, my name is Ethan. I want to start by saying thank you for speaking here today. It's been a great pleasure to listen to both of you guys talk about the amazing work that both your organizations are doing. It's been inspiring, especially to hear about all the positive impacts you think that AI is going to play in our lives moving forward. One of the things that does kind of concern me, which I wanted to ask both of you guys about as luminaries in the field, is how politics seems to be becoming more intertwined with the development of this technology, with other countries potentially posing, a threat to, the values that we're trying to instill in this technology. And I would reiterate, I think the work that you guys are doing and how you think about the development, especially the values that you impose in the development, is very strong. But I'm curious how you see this playing out and affecting the development of this technology, of this field, and moving forward. Like, what does this mean?
You're on the presidential committee.
Well, let me say that
advising President Biden.
So there are interesting multinational discussions going on, including some led by our State Department on specifically AI and shared values with nations we say that that are aligned in our values. What do we do as democracies when it comes to autocratic regimes is an interesting question. Can there be incentives? Can we work on expectations and standards of applications and prohibitions of AI when it comes to expressions of international laws of human rights? These are interesting questions. Can there be economic incentives to lean on countries, requiring them to harness AI in a way that's aligned with what we might say are values of human rights, civil liberties, freedom, privacy, no surveillance, for example. If you think back to writings like 1984, George Orwell, I mean, can you imagine that author even having the ability to envision what would be possible with surveillance one day? We're in that world now, and we have to be extremely caring about our laws and regulations, many of which already exist and will hold up and will protect people in society from uses that are invasive. Others that will have to be shaped over time, both generally as well as through use cases, as Fei-Fei mentioned, the various agencies that are already regulating various kinds of automation, including AI, to this day. I mean, today. So it's a really good question as to how the world grapples with these technologies when it comes to regimes, especially those that don't abide by what we refer to as the rule of law. Let's keep an eye on it.
One thing I think it's really important and HAI has leaned in on is actually think deeply about how to strengthen and maintain our democracy. So this is as much of a domestic issue as well as it's a geopolitical issue. And I think it's really important to recognize that the convergence of multiple technology, including AI, caused misinformation, disinformation, social media, and many things are also becoming challenging forces, sometimes adversarial forces to our own democracy, especially a democratic society. Speaking of values, is so much built upon trust and the kind of civil contract that of believing the information. So that is critical. And frankly, I personally worry about this more than AGI machine overlord is our own society, our democracy.
And I went quickly over this content provenance technical development. So the idea basically is several years ago, our teams at Microsoft, in coordination with other teams eventually over time, asked the question, in the world of AI, generative AI, deep fakes, manipulation, the shape-shifting of reality for people, what might be done to ensure that the photons hitting the light-sensitive display of a camera were the same photons you saw in your display through the whole pipeline of transmission, so we can trust our news, for example, and know there's been no manipulation from the trusted source. And this led to a set of technologies and prototypes which are extremely promising that are now being executed and implemented around the world. And I mentioned C2PA. It's called the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. It's a standards body with over 1,000 groups are now involved right now in building systems that talk to that standard. So someday soon, you'll be watching a video, or our kids will be seeing a video on their, whatever we call a browser in the future, and a light will come on, and it'll be required almost. Maybe videos that don't have this light will not even be deprecated, which basically gives the manifest information as to where this came from, what's happened along the way, so you can really inspect and understand the veracity of information. I have worried, and I've written about this in some scary papers. If you read some of my papers, the one on compositional deepfakes, which even writing it scared me, that we could be entering a post-epistemic world, that our grandkids can be in a world where you just can't know what's going on. And as Fei-Fei said, an informed citizenry is the foundation of democracy. And this is a concern up to the top levels of government right now, the erosion of our democracy, I should say democracies across the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think one issue here is you have some technical solutions for pieces of the problem, but this stuff could not be invented and rolled out quickly enough to maintain democracy, and you don't get it back easily. So
and there's no silver bullet. There's no one silver bullet. It's going to take a multi.
So let's take the next person in line there. We
Hi.
probably have at most time for maybe one more.
Hi, Ala Youssef. Thank you so much for your talk. Postdoctoral fellow at the AMI Center. I guess one question going back to your 10-year lecture, both of you have highlighted that the next 50 years are going to be critical. I think there's no better time to be in education and learning with ChatGPT and its powerful learning. But how do we make sure that the use of ChatGPT in education across all spectrums of education will continue to foster innovation, creativity, and help preserve our consciousness?
Well, so one thing I want to just be clear of where I stand is that I do think we should embrace tools, powerful tools like ChatGPT, because we hear a lot of from classroom teachers to even policymaker level, should we ban these tools from certain users? And as an educator myself, I see these tools as very, very powerful tools to help if we use it in the right way. So I just want to make it clear how exactly we use these tools to help, and how do we avoid the educational pitfalls, like fifth graders say, "Oh, we don't have to learn English anymore." That's clearly the wrong way of viewing and using this technology. Is really an area of incredible innovation and attention, as well as focus and also I think you use the word consciousness. I don't really know exactly what you mean, but I think in education, especially K-12 education, I also think a lot about agency. Human agency is really important. And no matter how powerful the tools are, instilling that, enhancing that, empowering that human agency for our children in their learning is deeply, profoundly a continued human endeavor. And no matter what tools we use, we need to ensure that. So that's, there are many examples of how to exactly use it. I'm not going to, given the time limit, you can check on some of the research our researchers are doing. But I just want to really make sure we understand our relationship with this tool is about empowering humans, empowering learning of humans.
And I'll say that around, it was probably end of November, OpenAI, in conjunction with other organizations, had a non-disclosure meeting with about 50 educators, including Khan Academy. And it was just a fabulous one-day workshop where everyone had access, and there's so many ideas. There's a blossoming of early work coming out from that early revelation of the technology. You've seen some of the videos by Sal Khan, for example, where that's gone. One of the things that's really amazed me about education power of these systems, that I think have barely been tapped yet, is they have a inspiring and scary, for the last topic, power of theory of mind. So in demos that I've done, I'll ask the system, boy, it's trying to explain to me quantum computing. I tell it, well, I know quantum chemistry, I know quantum physics. I'm a senior in high school, I've learned that, but what's this quantum computing business? Teach me. And at some point, I'll ask the system, why is this hard? What about this topic is hard to teach humans? And I get this beautiful list out about what's hard and why. I said, what are you going to do about it? Well, let me think. I could do more visualizations, use more analogies. I can go slower. I said, well, let's do it. And just the fact that the system can actually have a sense for, I'm not sure where it picked it up, in which corpora or synthesis it was doing, of which parts of this model will be hard for humans to get based on their experience, and to accordion out and slow down and generate pictures in ASCII in that case, early version of this. It gives me deep hope that these systems properly harnessed will be just incredible educators working with human teachers and students.
Yeah, I would just note again, you can probably find on our website, we had a great workshop here with the Stanford Accelerator for Learning, and we jointly had a workshop hosted by HAI in this space where a lot of educators and education faculty and researchers were discussing these issues. And in fact, our dean of the Graduate School of Education, Dan Schwartz, said, it's hard to ever get innovation into the education. It's very hard to change things. This is actually going to cause people, because they have no choice to change. So there will be some disruption, but it may actually lead to better education in some ways because there's no choice. Like, I have no idea how Stanford's going to evaluate, undergrad admissions essays next year. Things are going to have to change fast. So we're going to take one more question. I get to say something I never get to say that I like to say. Let's hear from the man in the yellow hat.
Hi, I'm Jacob Ritchie. I'm James's PhD student. I have a question.
You couldn't tell with his mask, I guess. The masked man. Yeah.
I have a question about terminology and whether you think, or like why you think AGI is the right word, or for Fei-Fei, whether you think it's the right word, given that it's fairly loaded, it doesn't have a clear technical definition. It can range from this model does well on a bunch of different tasks to machine overlords or Kurzweil style security.
I would note he's also co-advised by Manish Agarwal.
Okay. We know Manish very well. So the pursuit of artificial intelligence, with the phrase that John McCarthy came up with in 1955 and a half or so, and used in a proposal that stuck, has always been artificial general intelligence. That's my view on this. Look at the first system that was one of the famous systems that was built, General Problem Solver, GPS. That was the original GPS, Newell and Simon, which showed general principles for solving problems, metric spaces, planning islands, means ends analysis, and so on within logic spaces. I think that the AGI term came and was popularized from folks outside of the AI field who saw what was going on with successes, which were rightly so in the early 90s, late 90s, narrow applications. I have this medical system. They said, what we really want is something, this really cool vision, but it was really AI. It was really the original AI vision. Over the years, but I get what they were asking for. Over the years, I've said, I don't like AGI because it implies it's one thing you reach and you snap into it on the terminology front. It's either you're there or not, and it's something that humans have, versus maybe a continuum of some kind in many dimensions. And so I like saying towards more general artificial intelligence, talk about capabilities of synthesis, generation, cross-disciplinarity, cross-methodology. And because we've had this term floating around, unfortunately, mostly used by people concerned about existential risk, not AI researchers who are most interested in getting something done with a particular application. The terminology, when it was used in papers or in a title recently, gets people worried as opposed to excited in some ways. I think so. It goes back into a cultural set of connotations that came to be associated with the use of AGI as a scary general thing that's popping out of the box in an uncontrolled way, versus this has been the long-term vision of AI.
Yeah, I want to completely agree. The history that Eric just outlined is exactly what it is. As AI scientist, I never thought I entered the field of narrow intelligence.
Yeah, so, we do ANI.
Yeah, exactly. Alan Turing's audacious question of thinking machines, all the way to the founding fathers of AI, is always about this incredible ability. The most general intelligence we know on Earth is human intelligence so far, and we never call ourselves human general intelligence. So it's I'm not against this term, but I agree with Eric that the academic discipline, the research discipline, the term AI is born out of the scientific pursuit, whereas AGI was much more popularized through a commercialized kind of route. It's almost like clinics versus tissue papers, So it's fine if a lot of people use it, but really as a discipline, AI as a scientific discipline, the North Star of our field is always about the kind of intelligence that humans have and possibly going beyond humans.
But let me just say that I understand the concern, though, that comes up when there's a proclamation that we're seeing essence or sparks of something more general now, because we're not used to that as humans on the planet, seeing something like that in a machine. And so it does raise questions. Some people take that as really optimistic. Optimistic people take it as inspiring, as what the possibilities might be. Others take it as, competition for who it is that we are, as, our uniqueness and our identity. And that's scary to some people.
Okay, I think that's a good place for us to end on Stanford's John McCarthy and on Alan Turing. So let's give our speakers, Fei-Fei Li and Eric Horvitz, a hand.